The Fox News studio lights seemed particularly harsh that evening as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett settled into her seat opposite Mark Levin. The conservative host's popular show, Life, Liberty, and Levin, rarely featured progressive guests, making Crockett's appearance notable before a single word was spoken. The tension in the studio was palpable as crew members exchanged glances, knowing that this unlikely pairing promised fireworks. Levin, a former Reagan administration official turned influential conservative media figure, had spent the week promoting this interview, promising his audience a substantive examination of Crockett's positions on constitutional issues. For her part, the freshman congresswoman from Texas had accepted the invitation despite warnings from staff, believing that engagement across ideological divides was essential in a fractured political landscape. "Congresswoman Crockett," Levin began, his voice carrying the measured tone that regular viewers recognized as the calm before the storm. "You've made numerous statements about constitutional interpretations that, frankly, contradict the founding principles of this republic." Crockett nodded, maintaining eye contact. "I appreciate you having me on, Mark. I'm looking forward to a substantive discussion." "Let's start with substance, then," Levin replied, lifting a folder containing printed pages. "These are your statements from congressional hearings over the past 6 months. You've repeatedly characterized originalist constitutional interpretation as, and I quote, a convenient cover for imposing regressive policy preferences. Do you stand by that characterization?" It was a direct challenge to a fundamental conservative legal principle from the outset, and Crockett seemed momentarily taken aback by the immediate confrontation. Levin continued before she could respond. "Because if you do," he said, his voice rising slightly, "you're not just disagreeing with contemporary conservatives, but with the explicit writings of Madison, Hamilton, and Jefferson. Are you suggesting you understand the Constitution better than its framers?" The ambush strategy was clear. Begin with an accusation framed as a question. Follow with evidence that appeared damning when taken out of context, and top it with a challenge designed to put the guest on immediate defense. It was a technique Levin had employed countless times against progressive guests, and it typically led to flustered responses that confirmed his audience's preconceptions. What happened next, however, wasn't in the standard playbook. Instead of becoming defensive or retreating to talking points, Crockett smiled slightly and reached into her own folder. What followed was 5 minutes of the most unexpected intellectual combat ever broadcast on cable news, culminating in an exchange so stunning that the clip would be viewed 50 million times within 24 hours. No one, least of all Mark Levin, anticipated that his attempt to humiliate the Congresswoman would lead to her delivering a final statement so powerful that it would literally break the internet, forcing even her strongest critics to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about constitutional debate in modern America. If you want to see exactly how this extraordinary confrontation unfolded and hear the final statement from Congresswoman Crockett that left Mark Levin speechless and broke the internet, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell to never miss these explosive political confrontations that change the national conversation. Now, let's dive into this remarkable exchange that has constitutional scholars, political commentators, and millions of Americans still talking weeks later. Mark Levin had built his media career on intellectual combat. A Harvard-educated lawyer who had served as chief of staff to Attorney General Edwin Meese during the Reagan administration, Levin possessed both the credentials and rhetorical skills to dismantle progressive arguments with surgical precision. His radio show and Fox News program had made him one of conservative media's most influential voices, known for eviscerating opponents with a combination of historical references, constitutional citations, and barely contained contempt for what he viewed as leftist ignorance of America's founding principles. "He doesn't debate, he prosecutes," one media critic had written. Levin approaches every interview like a cross-examination designed not to elicit information, but to establish guilt. This prosecutorial approach had proven devastatingly effective against progressive guests who came armed with talking points rather than substantive knowledge. Levin's extensive legal background and encyclopedic knowledge of founding-era documents allowed him to expose superficial understanding with targeted questions that his opponents rarely anticipated. The resulting viral clips of flustered progressives unable to defend their positions had become a staple of conservative social media. For this particular episode, Levin had spent days preparing what he clearly expected to be another trophy interview. Congresswoman Crockett's recent prominence on issues from voting rights to judicial ethics had made her a rising star in Democratic circles, and therefore a prime target for the kind of intellectual takedown that drove Levin's ratings. Across the studio sat Jasmine Crockett, whose path to Congress had been anything but traditional. Before entering politics, the 42-year-old had built her reputation as a formidable civil rights attorney in Texas, known for her methodical preparation and unflappable courtroom demeanor. Her transition from litigator to legislator had been fueled by the same qualities that had made her effective before judges: meticulous research, precise language, and an ability to remain calm under pressure. She approaches congressional hearings the way she approached trials, a former law partner had told the Washington Post. She never asks a question without knowing the answer, and she never makes a claim she can't substantiate with documentation. This background made Crockett an unusually well-prepared target for Levin's approach. Unlike politicians who relied on staffers to brief them on policy positions, Crockett brought a lawyer's habit of direct engagement with primary sources. Her office was known for distributing comprehensive research packets rather than messaging guidance, an approach that reflected her belief that the strongest progressive arguments are those grounded in factual and legal reality rather than aspirational rhetoric. The stakes of this television confrontation extended far beyond ratings or individual reputations. In a broader political context, it represented the collision of two fundamentally different approaches to constitutional interpretation that had divided American jurisprudence for generations. Levin embodied the originalist tradition that dominated conservative legal thought, insisting that constitutional provisions should be understood according to their original public meaning at the time of ratification. Crockett represented a progressive vision that viewed the Constitution as a living document whose principles required reinterpretation to address modern realities the framers could never have anticipated. This philosophical divide had practical implications for virtually every major political issue, from voting rights and executive power to economic regulation and civil liberties. The different approaches to constitutional interpretation weren't merely academic disagreements, but fundamentally shaped how Americans understood the proper role of government in addressing society's most pressing challenges. For viewers across the political spectrum, the confrontation between Levin and Crockett represented a rare opportunity to see these competing visions articulated by formidable advocates rather than reduced to simplistic caricatures. What no one anticipated was that this exchange would transcend typical political theater to become something far more consequential, a moment that would challenge assumptions on both sides and potentially reshape how Americans across the ideological divide understood their constitutional heritage. Congresswoman, I'm still waiting for you to explain how your interpretation improves on Madison's understanding of the Constitution he helped write, Levin pressed, his tone conveying growing impatience. He had spent the previous 10 minutes citing Federalist Papers and early congressional debates, building what appeared to be an airtight case for originalist interpretation. Throughout this opening salvo, Crockett had listened attentively, taking occasional notes but offering only brief responses. This restraint clearly frustrated Levin, who was accustomed to opponents attempting immediate rebuttals that he could then dismantle piece by piece. I appreciate your comprehensive overview, Mark, Crockett finally replied, but I think we're starting from a flawed premise. You've characterized my position as rejecting originalism entirely, when I've actually advocated for a more complete originalist approach, one that considers the full historical record rather than selective portions of it. Levin appeared momentarily taken aback by this unexpected framing. A more complete originalist approach? That's a convenient rhetorical device to justify progressive policy preferences while claiming historical legitimacy. It's not rhetoric, but methodology, Crockett responded, opening her folder. For example, you cited Federalist 51 on the separation of powers, but you omitted Madison's explicit acknowledgement that the constitutional system would require adaptation as the nation evolved. In his 1816 letter to Spencer Roane, Madison wrote that in the application of precedents, it was impossible to avoid difficulties, all the most important decisions being made by the successive subjects of them. She looked directly at Levin. That's Madison himself, acknowledging that constitutional interpretation would necessarily involve adaptation beyond the founding moment, not rejecting original meaning, but recognizing its application would evolve. Levin shifted slightly, clearly surprised by the specific citation. Isolated statements don't override the clear structural principles established in the constitutional text and consistently explained in the Federalist Papers. I agree completely about not cherry-picking isolated statements, Crockett replied, which is why I've brought the complete correspondence between Madison and Jefferson from 1789 through 1826, not selective quotations, but their full discussion of how constitutional principles would apply to circumstances they hadn't anticipated. She turned to another document. For instance, when confronting the question of whether the Constitution permitted the Louisiana Purchase, something not explicitly addressed in the text, Jefferson initially believed he needed a constitutional amendment. He later changed his position, writing to John Breckinridge that the good sense of our country will correct the evil of loose construction when it shall produce ill effects. Crockett looked up. That's the author of the Declaration of Independence, acknowledging that strict construction might need to yield to practical governance. Not abandoning original principles, but recognizing their application requires consideration of consequences. The dynamic was shifting visibly. Levin had clearly expected to confront progressive talking points about a living constitution that he could easily dismiss with founding-era citations. Instead, Crockett was challenging him on his own terrain, citing the same historical figures, but presenting a more nuanced picture of their views on constitutional interpretation. Levin attempted to regain momentum. These cherry-picked quotations don't negate the framers' consistent emphasis on fixed constitutional meaning as a constraint on government power. I couldn't agree more about the importance of constraints, Crockett replied, turning to another document. Which is why I've also brought the Anti-Federalist Papers and ratification debate transcripts from states like Virginia and New York, where significant concerns were raised about how constitutional provisions would be interpreted over time. She held up the document. Patrick Henry and George Mason specifically warned that future interpretations might undermine individual liberties if the Constitution was read too narrowly. Mason argued that rights protections would need to be understood in light of evolving threats to liberty, not just those the founders had personally experienced under British rule. Levin's expression had transformed from confident prosecutor to concerned defendant. This wasn't the conversation he had prepared for. Rather than dismissing originalism, Crockett was essentially arguing for a more comprehensive originalist approach that considered the full range of founding-era thought, including the evolution of the framers' own views and the concerns raised during ratification debates. What the Congresswoman is attempting here is a clever rhetorical strategy, Levin said, addressing his audience rather than Crockett directly, a telltale sign that he was playing defense rather than offense. By selectively citing certain statements, she's attempting to undermine the clear original meaning of constitutional provisions. I welcome examination of any historical evidence I've misrepresented, Crockett responded calmly. Every document I've cited is available in the public record. My point isn't that originalism is wrong. It's that a truly originalist approach requires engaging with the full historical record, including the framers' recognition that constitutional principles would need application to circumstances they hadn't anticipated. The tension continued to build as Crockett maintained her methodical approach, never raising her voice or making personal attacks, but systematically presenting historical evidence that complicated Levin's more rigid portrayal of founding-era constitutional understanding. It was becoming increasingly clear to everyone watching, including Levin himself, that this interview wasn't proceeding according to the expected script. Instead of the typical spectacle of a progressive politician floundering against Levin's constitutional expertise, viewers were witnessing something far more extraordinary. A genuine, substantive debate between two knowledgeable advocates with fundamentally different understandings of America's constitutional tradition. "Congresswoman," Levin said, his tone now carrying a defensive edge, "these historical footnotes don't change the fundamental reality that progressive constitutionalism essentially empowers judges and politicians to rewrite the Constitution according to contemporary preferences rather than adhering to its fixed meaning." "That's precisely what I'm arguing against," Crockett replied, surprising Levin again. "Judges should never rewrite the Constitution. The question is how we determine its meaning when applying 18th century text to 21st century circumstances." She turned to another document. "Consider the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures." The framers couldn't have imagined cell phones, digital surveillance, or GPS tracking. Applying the amendment's principles to these technologies isn't rewriting the Constitution. It's fulfilling our obligation to apply its underlying principles to new circumstances. Levin attempted to interrupt, but Crockett continued. And this isn't a progressive versus conservative distinction. Justice Scalia, the leading originalist of the modern era, wrote in Kyllo versus United States that thermal imaging of a home constituted a search requiring a warrant, even though this technology didn't exist when the Fourth Amendment was written. He applied original principles to new circumstances rather than limiting the amendment's protection to only those technologies the framers knew. The reference to Scalia, a conservative icon, visibly caught Levin off guard. Crockett was effectively arguing that even the most committed originalists recognized the need to apply constitutional principles to circumstances the framers couldn't have anticipated. Justice Scalia was applying the original principle, not inventing new rights, Levin countered. "Exactly my point," Crockett replied immediately. "Applying original principles to new circumstances is precisely what thoughtful constitutional interpretation requires, not rigid adherence to 18th century applications, but fidelity to the underlying principles when confronting modern questions." The dynamic had completely transformed. What began as Levin's attempted takedown of a progressive politician had become a sophisticated debate about constitutional methodology, with Crockett demonstrating unexpected command of both founding-era documents and modern jurisprudence. Levin tried another approach. "Your voting rights legislation clearly contradicts the framers' understanding of federalism by imposing federal control over state election procedures." The framers' understanding of federalism evolved significantly after the Civil War, Crockett responded without hesitation. The Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th and 15th, fundamentally altered the federal-state balance regarding fundamental rights. The original Constitution's federalism must be understood as modified by these later amendments, which explicitly empowered Congress to enforce equal protection and voting rights guarantees. She turned to another document. Senator Jacob Howard, who introduced the 14th Amendment in the Senate, explicitly stated that it would grant Congress power to protect fundamental rights against state infringement, a dramatic shift from the original constitutional design. To cite pre-Civil War understandings of federalism without acknowledging how the Reconstruction Amendments transformed that relationship isn't originalism, it's selective history. Levin appeared increasingly frustrated as Crockett continued presenting specific historical evidence that complicated his more straightforward narrative about constitutional interpretation. The interview had become something neither he nor his audience had anticipated. Not a humiliation of a progressive politician, but a sophisticated debate between two knowledgeable advocates with different understandings of constitutional history. The Congresswoman's revisionist approach would effectively eliminate any meaningful constraints on government power, Levin attempted, trying to return to familiar territory. On the contrary, Crockett replied, I'm arguing for fidelity to all constitutional constraints, including those found in amendments beyond the original 7 articles. The Reconstruction Amendments, the Progressive Era Amendments, and the Civil Rights Amendments all modified the original constitutional structure in significant ways. True originalism requires understanding these provisions according to their original public meaning as well. She paused, then delivered what would become the interview's most widely shared moment. Mark, we both reverence the Constitution. The difference is that I'm advocating for reading the whole document, not just the parts written by slaveholders. The studio fell completely silent. It wasn't a partisan attack, but a historically accurate observation that much of the original Constitution reflected compromises with slavery, compromises later explicitly rejected by constitutional amendments that fundamentally altered the federal-state relationship regarding fundamental rights. Levin appeared momentarily speechless, recognizing that responding defensively would only highlight the historical accuracy of Crockett's observation. The dynamic had completely reversed. The prosecutor had become the defendant, and the intended target was now controlling the conversation with calm, substantive arguments grounded in specific historical evidence. We'll take a break, Levin finally said, looking toward his producer with an expression that conveyed both frustration and resignation. More with Congresswoman Crockett after this. As the cameras cut away, crew members exchanged glances, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented in the show's history. A guest who had not only withstood Levin's initial assault, but had effectively turned the tables through superior preparation and command of the historical record. What no one yet realized was that the most extraordinary moment was still to come, a final statement from Crockett after the commercial break that would not only complete her intellectual triumph, but literally break the internet as millions of Americans across the political spectrum confronted a perspective on constitutional interpretation that transcended typical partisan framing. When the cameras returned from commercial break, the shift in dynamic was immediately apparent. Levin's typically aggressive posture had given way to a more measured approach, while Crockett appeared entirely comfortable, her documents neatly arranged before her. Congresswoman, before the break, you made an inflammatory suggestion about parts of the Constitution being written by slaveholders, Levin began, attempting to characterize her historically accurate observation as a partisan attack. That wasn't meant to be inflammatory, but historically contextual, Crockett replied calmly. The 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the 20-year protection for the slave trade were explicit constitutional accommodations of slavery. The original Constitution protected an institution we all now recognize as fundamentally immoral. That's not controversial history. It's documented fact. She paused, then continued. My point wasn't to dismiss the original Constitution, but to highlight that constitutional understanding must include the amendments specifically designed to repudiate these compromises. The Reconstruction Amendments weren't minor adjustments, but transformative changes to the constitutional order. This framing made it difficult for Levin to respond without appearing to minimize the significance of amendments that abolished slavery and guaranteed equal protection, provisions broadly supported across the political spectrum. It was another example of Crockett's strategic approach, focusing on common ground rather than partisan division. We can recognize the founders' brilliance while acknowledging their human limitations, she continued. They created a constitutional system capable of evolution toward more perfect realization of its ideals, including through amendments that repudiated some of their own compromises. That's not disrespecting their work, but fulfilling its promise. As the interview concluded, Levin asked what he clearly intended as a challenging final question. What would you say to Americans who believe progressive constitutional interpretation has undermined the rule of law, by replacing fixed meaning with subjective preferences. It was this question that prompted Crockett's now famous response, the statement that would literally break the internet as millions of Americans across the political spectrum encountered a perspective on constitutional interpretation that defied conventional partisan framing. "I'd say that constitutional fidelity requires intellectual honesty," Crockett began, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "Honesty about the full historical record, not just selected portions that support our preferred outcomes. Honesty about the ways the Constitution has been amended precisely to reject certain original understandings. And honesty about the inevitable responsibility each generation bears in applying constitutional principles to circumstances the framers couldn't have imagined." She paused briefly. "The Constitution doesn't belong to conservatives or progressives, to originalists or living constitutionalists. It belongs to the American people, all of us. Our debates about its meaning aren't a crisis, but a feature of constitutional democracy. They reflect our ongoing commitment to governing ourselves according to principles that transcend momentary majorities." Crockett looked directly at the camera. "What threatens constitutional democracy isn't good faith disagreement about interpretation. It's the cynical pretense that complex constitutional questions have obvious answers, that your political opponents aren't just wrong, but are willfully betraying America's founding principles." Her voice remained measured, but carried unmistakable moral authority. "We can disagree profoundly about how to apply constitutional principles without questioning each other's commitment to those principles. That's the conversation America needs, not partisan performance where we pretend the Constitution perfectly aligns with our contemporary political preferences, but honest engagement with its complexities, its contradictions, and its capacity for guiding a diverse nation toward more perfect realization of its highest ideals." As she finished speaking, even Levin appeared momentarily moved by the sincerity and substance of her appeal. Rather than the anticipated humiliation of a progressive politician, viewers had witnessed something far more extraordinary, a genuine, substantive exchange that challenged assumptions across the political spectrum about constitutional interpretation and democratic discourse. The aftermath was immediate and unprecedented. Within hours, the full interview, and particularly Crockett's final statement, had gone viral across social media platforms, with the closing segment alone garnering over 50 million views within 24 hours. What made this virality remarkable wasn't just the numbers, but the cross-ideological nature of the sharing. Conservative and progressive commentators alike acknowledged the substance and sincerity of Crockett's perspective, even when disagreeing with her specific conclusions. "This is what serious constitutional discourse should look like," wrote conservative legal scholar Orrin Kerr. Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated that progressive constitutional vision can be grounded in historical understanding rather than dismissing it. That's a conversation worth having across ideological lines. From the progressive side, Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe observed that Crockett has provided a masterclass in how to engage originalist arguments on their own terrain while demonstrating their limitations. This isn't about scoring political points, but advancing genuine understanding of our constitutional inheritance. The interview's impact extended beyond commentary to actual changes in public discourse. Law schools reported that applications for constitutional law courses increased dramatically, with many applicants specifically citing the Levin-Crockett exchange as inspiring deeper engagement with constitutional questions. Civic education organizations received unprecedented requests for founding-era documents and Reconstruction-era amendments, suggesting renewed public interest in primary constitutional sources rather than partisan interpretations. Perhaps most significantly, polling conducted in the weeks following the interview showed subtle but meaningful shifts in public understanding of constitutional issues. While Americans remained divided on specific policy questions, researchers noted increased willingness across partisan lines to acknowledge the complexity of constitutional interpretation and recognize legitimate differences in methodology rather than attributing disagreement to bad faith. What Congresswoman Crockett achieved wasn't converting viewers to her specific constitutional vision, explained public opinion researcher Michael Dymock. It was demonstrating that constitutional disagreement can reflect good faith differences in interpretive approach rather than mere political opportunism. That perspective appears to be resonating with Americans tired of hyperpolarized discourse that treats complex questions as if they have obvious answers. For Crockett herself, the aftermath brought both increased prominence and new opportunities for advancing substantive discourse. Rather than leveraging her viral moment for standard partisan advantage, she launched a series of town halls titled Constitutional Conversations, featuring dialogue with legal scholars across the ideological spectrum. These events modeled the same approach she had demonstrated in the Levin interview: respectful engagement with different perspectives grounded in specific historical and legal evidence rather than partisan talking points. As for Mark Levin, his response to the unexpected outcome demonstrated why he remained a significant voice in conservative media, despite the interview not proceeding as planned. Rather than ignoring the episode or dismissing Crockett's arguments, he dedicated a subsequent show to responding substantively to her historical claims, acknowledging the sophistication of her approach while defending his originalist methodology. The Congresswoman presented a more serious, progressive constitutional vision than we typically encounter, Levin told his audience. While I fundamentally disagree with her conclusions, her arguments deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal. That's how constitutional discourse should work in a healthy republic. This acknowledgement of Crockett's substantive contribution, even while maintaining disagreement with her conclusions, modeled precisely the approach to constitutional discourse that she had advocated in her viral final statement: engagement based on mutual recognition of good faith rather than assumptions of constitutional betrayal. For millions of Americans across the political spectrum, the exchange between Levin and Crockett represented something increasingly rare in contemporary politics: a genuine, substantive debate where both participants demonstrated deep knowledge of the subject matter and fundamental respect for the constitutional tradition they interpreted differently. The conversation reminded viewers that constitutional disagreement need not reflect cynical partisan manipulation, but can emerge from good faith differences in understanding America's complex constitutional inheritance. As one viewer commented on the viral clip, "I've never seen a political interview that made me want to read the Constitution instead of just arguing about it." Whatever your politics, that's something worth supporting. If you found this breakdown of the historic Levin Crockett exchange informative, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of the most important constitutional conversations in America. Click the notification bell to make sure you never miss our coverage of the discussions that reshape our understanding of America's founding principles. Your support helps us continue bringing you substantive analysis that goes beyond partisan talking points to focus on the constitutional principles that unite us as Americans despite our political differences.